You've probably had moments where you felt tired and didn't know if it was real. Maybe you were supposed to work on something, and suddenly you felt exhausted. Or you were thinking about starting a task, and your body felt heavy, like you needed to rest. But then you did something else, something easier or more enjoyable, and the tiredness disappeared. And you couldn't tell if you were actually tired or if you were just avoiding the thing you didn't want to do. This isn't about being lazy or lying to yourself. It's about the fact that tiredness and avoidance can feel almost identical in your body. And your brain doesn't always make it easy to tell them apart. Because both produce the same signal, which is resistance. And that resistance shows up as fatigue, regardless of what's causing it. Most people assume that tiredness is a physical state. You're either tired or you're not. If you feel tired, it means your body needs rest. But that's not the full picture. Tiredness can be physical, but it can also be psychological. And psychological tiredness often mimics physical tiredness so closely that you can't distinguish between them without paying very close attention. When you're faced with a task that feels difficult, unpleasant, or emotionally demanding, your brain generates resistance. That resistance is a form of self-protection. Your brain is trying to steer you away from something that requires effort or discomfort. And one of the ways it does that is by making you feel tired. Not fake tired. Actually tired. The fatigue is real. But the cause isn't physical depletion. It's avoidance. Research into motivation and task aversion shows that the brain can produce fatigue as a response to anticipated effort. It's not that you're imagining the tiredness. It's that your brain is using tiredness as a signal to stop you from engaging with something it perceives as costly. And because the tiredness feels physical, you interpret it as a need to rest, even when rest isn't what you actually need. Let's say you sit down to work on a report that's due soon. You slept fine the night before, you've had coffee, you're not physically exhausted. But as soon as you open the document, you feel drained. Your eyes feel heavy, your body feels sluggish, you just want to lie down. So you tell yourself you need a break. You scroll on your phone or watch something, and suddenly the tiredness is gone. You feel fine. But the report still isn't done. Or think about someone who feels too tired to exercise after work. They've been sitting at a desk all day, so physically they haven't exerted much energy. But the idea of going to the gym feels overwhelming. They feel tired just thinking about it. So they skip it. But then they spend the next 2 hours doing other things that require energy, like cooking or cleaning or running errands, and they don't feel tired during any of that. This is where the uncomfortable part comes in. The tiredness you feel when you're avoiding something isn't necessarily less legitimate than physical tiredness. It's a real signal from your brain. But it's not a signal that you need rest. It's a signal that your brain is trying to protect you from something it perceives as unpleasant or difficult. And because your brain can't always tell the difference between a real threat and an uncomfortable task, it uses the same defense mechanism for both. Studies on cognitive and emotional fatigue suggest that mental effort can be just as depleting as physical effort. When you're doing something that requires focus, decision-making, or emotional regulation, your brain uses resources. And when those resources run low, you feel tired. But the brain can also anticipate that depletion before it happens. It looks ahead at a task, predicts how much effort it will require, and generates fatigue preemptively to discourage you from starting. There's also the issue of task-specific tiredness. You might feel exhausted at the thought of doing one thing but perfectly energized to do something else. If the tiredness were purely physical, it would apply to everything equally. But it doesn't. You can feel too tired to write an email but not too tired to text a friend. You can feel too tired to clean but not too tired to scroll. That selectivity is a clue that the tiredness is at least partially about avoidance. Research into procrastination and self-regulation shows that people often misinterpret avoidance as a physical need. When you don't want to do something, your brain doesn't just tell you that directly. It creates a sensation that feels like a valid reason to stop. Tiredness is one of the most common sensations it uses because tiredness is socially acceptable and hard to argue with. If you're tired, of course you should rest. No one can fault you for that. Here's the thing that makes this so confusing. Sometimes you're actually tired and you're also avoiding something. The two can coexist. You might be physically depleted from a long day, and on top of that, you're facing a task you don't want to do. In those cases, the tiredness is real, but it's also being amplified by avoidance. And separating the two becomes almost impossible. This doesn't mean you're faking tiredness or that you should ignore it when it shows up. It just means that not all tiredness is solved by rest. If you rest and the tiredness persists only for certain tasks, that's a signal that avoidance is involved. And if the tiredness disappears as soon as you switch to something easier or more enjoyable, that's another signal. The reason this is so difficult to navigate is that your brain doesn't announce its motives. It doesn't tell you, "I'm making you feel tired because I don't want you to do this thing." It just generates the sensation and lets you interpret it. And most of the time, you interpret it as a need to rest, because that's what tiredness usually means. But in the case of avoidance-based fatigue, resting doesn't fix the problem. It just delays it. There's also the fact that acknowledging avoidance feels worse than acknowledging tiredness. If you're tired, it's not your fault. You need rest. That's reasonable. But if you're avoiding something, it feels like a personal failure. Like you should just push through or stop being difficult. So your brain defaults to the explanation that feels less judgmental, even when it's not the accurate one. So if you've ever felt tired and couldn't tell if it was real or if you were just avoiding something, this is probably why. The two produce nearly identical sensations. And your brain doesn't always make the distinction clear. The tiredness is real either way. But the solution isn't always rest. Sometimes it's just starting the thing you don't want to do and noticing if the tiredness fades once you're in motion.